Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the penultimate NCLA event of this semester. Vidyan Ravinthiran, who's joining us from Harvard University, is the author of two poetry collections, both published by Bloodaxe, Grun-tu-molani from 2014, and more recently, The Million-Petalled Flower of Being Here, which won a Northern Writers Award, was a PBS Recommendation, and was shortlisted for the Forward and T.S. Eliot Prizes. But as well as being a distinguished poet, Vidyan is also an acclaimed and insightful poetry critic, and it's in this capacity that he'll be speaking with us this evening. His critical study of Elizabeth Bishop's Prosaic, published by Bucknell University Press in 2015, won both the University English Prize and the Warren Brooks Award for Outstanding Literary Criticism. His next, on Spontaneity and Form in Modern Prose, is forthcoming from Oxford University Press. The NCLA Poetry Lecture Series, delivered for many years in collaboration with Bloodaxe, has a long and illustrious history and has resulted in multiple books of essays by practicing poets, which have proved touchstones of contemporary criticism. More recently, the Newcastle Poetry Festival has included a poetry lecture slot co-hosted by the Royal Literary Fund, which has seen Sasha Dugdale speak on the primacy of Pushkin in the contemporary national Russian consciousness, and in 2019, Aishian Hutchinson speak brilliantly on the poetic afterlives of Frederick Douglass. Vidyan was due to be with us in person at the 2020 Newcastle Poetry Festival in May to deliver this year's lecture on Keats. This had to be cancelled, of course, because of COVID-19, and so it is entirely fitting that the lecture Vidyan was due to give has metamorphosed into a consideration of Keats and social distancing, as well as of writers and their relationship to the news in this year of terrible news. So I'll hand over to Vidyan now. There's a handout which you can access by clicking the link on the chat function if you haven't already been sent it. As the lecture unfolds, please post questions for Vidyan via the chat function too. The lecture will last for 45 minutes with time for a brief Q&A at the end. So thank you so much, Vidyan, for joining us all the way from America. And we're so excited. I'll hand over to you now. Thanks again.
Thank you, Sinead. Well, thank you, everyone, for tuning in for this. One thing I should say is because of the way this is working, I won't be able to see the questions and things that you're posting in the chat, but please do ask those questions later on if there's a chance, and I'd love to continue talking with any of you after all this is over about Keats. Please get in touch if there's anything you'd like to talk about. Okay, so Keats and social distancing. Lionel Trilling, the critic, said that the Romantic poet John Keats was the only writer as admired for his letters as for his published work. And there's a lot that's of intense, molten, affecting relevance in his correspondence to the situation we face now and may have to live with for years. For a poet who worked as a surgeon's assistant and who lost both his parents in childhood, Keats nursed his mother and also later his brother Tom as they died of the tuberculosis that would eventually kill him too at the age of 25. Because of all of that, ill health became a presiding concern for Keats. So Keats's letters, especially what's called his journal letters to his brother George, who emigrated to Kentucky, are really touching because of the way they describe distance. Keats's dash hectic, freewheeling letter prose turns writing back into speech and absence into presence. It's a bit like the video calls that are vital to us now. These letters are courageous collaborations with distant loved ones. Distance and alienation, says Keats, may be obviated by a willful and dramatic exercise of our minds towards each other. Keats fantasizes about a technology like Zoom or Skype or WhatsApp when he writes to his friend J.H. Reynolds that it would be no bad thing to be the favorite of some fairy who would give one the power of seeing how our friends got on at a distance. But illness enters these passages too, as when, wishing his prose were something like a webcam, he says to his brother George, "I should wish to give you a picture of our lives here whenever by a touch I can do it, even as you must see by the last sentence our walk past Whitehall, all in good health and spirits." So whenever he talks about distance, he talks about health. He writes to his sister Fanny, "We've been very little together, but you have not the less been with me in thought." And he says, "You did not say a word about your chilblains. Write me directly and let me know about them. Your letter shall be answered like an echo." Keats wishes to speak face to face, and it's that unsatisfiable yearning that turns in his letters into a focus on the physical body, because we often worry about the health of loved ones we can't be with. We quiz and pester and scold them. In 1820, the last year of his life, Keats was trapped on a quarantine ship in Naples Harbour, and there's an obvious parallel here with the plight of those passengers on the Diamond Princess that was infested with coronavirus and stuck for 27 days in Tokyo Bay. And Keats wrote of this situation, "Every man who can row his boat and walk and talk seems a different being from myself. I do not feel in the world." Earlier that same year, he was separated from his love Fanny Brawn by a smaller yet still infinite distance. "When I send this round, I shall be in the front parlour watching to see you show yourself for a minute in the garden. How illness stands as a barrier betwixt me and you." So whenever Keats thinks of distance, separation, and how writing can annul distance and separation, he also thinks of health and sickness. So it becomes really important in the letters that Keats manages his own health carefully. He says this explicitly, so he'll one day be able to see Reynolds married, or be able to visit his brother George and George's wife Georgiana in the US. He says to George, "Take it calmly and let your health be the prime consideration. I hope you will have a son, and it is one of my first wishes to have him in my arms, which I will do, please God, before he cuts one double tooth." And it's really hard for me to read that without a lot of very personal feelings. Just like George emigrated to the US, we emigrated to the US in January because of lockdown. Our son's grandparents haven't been able to see him all year. The thing about Keats's letters is that they seem to articulate the hopes and fears of so many of us today. Like when he writes to Charles Brown in September 1819, "I look forward with a good hope that we shall one day be passing free, untrammeled, unanxious time together." Keats's great journal letter to George and Georgiana, written over several days, December 1818 and January 1819, begins with the heartbreaking news that his brother Tom is dead, except Keats suspects that George and Georgiana have already heard this. So the feelings he expresses he recognizes out of step with the realities of delayed transatlantic post. And so what happens in the rest of the letter is you get this rich, deep, pained, complex discussion of distance and different kinds of distance, and all of it has Tom's death in mind. So on the one hand, Keats is thinking about literal geographic distance, like the distance between London and Kentucky. He's also thinking about the types of cultural and psychological distance that keep us from understanding each other. And finally, he's also thinking of a kind of heavenly distance. He's thinking about an afterlife that is probably modeled on John Milton's Paradise Lost, which was a really important poem for him. So in this letter, and this is on the handout, Keats says, "Sometimes I fancy an immense separation, and sometimes as at present, a direct communication of spirit with you. That will be one of the grandeurs of immortality. There'll be no space, and consequently, the only commerce between spirits will be by their intelligence of each other, when they will completely understand each other. while we in this world merely comprehend each other in different degrees. So, though I've begun with illness and Keats's letters, this essay is also about other kinds of social distancing. So I use that phrase to talk about our understandings and misunderstandings of ourselves, of each other, and also works of literature. And I'll concentrate on Keats's masterpiece, To Autumn. I'll also talk about his letter poem, Dear Reynolds, Last Night I Lay in Bed, and a passage from his long romance, Isabella or the Pot of Basil. And I'll also mention the poetry of Claudia Rankine and Martin Carter, because sometimes I think that the best literary criticism of poetry really comes from poetry itself. And I think that poetry is itself kind of knowledge, tells us something about the world. So I use the term social distancing to examine the changing, technologically shifted relation between the private and the public life today, and also the question of how close to politics a poem should strive to be. If we've learned that the public good may be served by our withdrawing from public life and self-isolating, I'd like to hazard the idea that in our personal lives and in our literature, being genuinely, reflectively political may also involve what seems a counterintuitive step backward, out of the streams of information and misinformation, where opinions and fake facts not only spread, as we say, virally, but maybe really do affect us like a virus at a level beneath conscious thought. How distanced from others or how connected to them should we ideally be if we're to discover who we really are and what we really think? Okay, so this is the academic bit. So I will try and sort of make this academic debate relevant to everyone, because I think we're at a point where we can see that some academic debates do actually touch on our daily lives. And so what I'm going to talk about a little bit is the concept of romantic ideology promoted by the critic Jerome McGann, and how he applied this to the disappearing act he discovered within Keats's ode To Autumn. So I think the best thing first is for me to read out loud this great and controversial masterpiece, which is on the handout. Season of mists and mellow fruitfulness, close bosom friend of the maturing sun, conspiring with him how to load and bless with fruit the vines that round the thatch eaves run, to bend with apples the mossed cottage trees, and fill all fruit with ripeness to the core, to swell the gourd and plump the hazel shells with a sweet kernel, to set budding more and still more later flowers for the bees, until they think warm days will never cease, for summer has o'erbrimmed their clammy cells. You can see Keats, is famous as such a lushly descriptive poet for his effects of sound. You can see that throughout that stanza. I'm always very affected by how cease doesn't quite fully rhyme with bees, does it? It's a slightly foreclosed, sorry, sad sound. Who hath not seen thee oft amid thy store? Sometimes whoever seeks abroad may find thee sitting careless on a granary floor, thy hair soft lifted by the winnowing wind. And Keats loves these sorts of compounds where he'll put the word soft in, soft lifted. Or on a half-reaped furrow sound asleep, drowsed with a fume of poppies, while thy hook spares the next swathe and all its twined flowers. And sometimes like a gleaner thou dost keep steady thy laden head across a brook, or by a cider press with patient look thou watchest the last oozings hours by hours. Where are the songs of spring? Aye, where are they? Think not of them. Thou hast thy music too, while barred clouds bloom the soft dying day, and touch the stubble plains with rosy hue. Then in a wailful choir the small gnats mourn among the river sallows, borne aloft or sinking as the light wind lives or dies, and full-grown lambs loud bleat from hilly bourne, hedge crickets sing, and now with treble soft the redbreast whistles from a garden croft, and gathering swallows twitter in the skies. So you might think, how could that be a controversial poem? It's a poem about autumn, right? But for McGann, Keats's 1820 volume of poems, and this poem in particular, is an attempt, I quote, to dissolve social and political conflicts in the mediations of art and beauty. England was, as today, a country divided. On August 16, 1819, demonstrators for parliamentary reform were charged on by the army at St. Peter's Fields in Manchester. Many died, and this act of state repression became immortalized as playing on Waterloo, the Peterloo Massacre. So McGann's accusation, Keats, is that Keats's poem doesn't simply ignore such things, but it actively wills them out of existence. And it also replaces the precarity of agricultural laborers with a sort of personified autumn figure gliding at leisure through a Vaseline-lensed, soft focus, effortless, idealized, pastoral. So Keats's poem was sort of defended against this attack by both less historical critics, Paul Fry and Helen Vendler, and also other historical critics, or as we call them, historicist critics, like Nicholas Rowe, for whom Keats's poem is about Peterloo, for whom the autumn figure resembles the figure of justice on the banners of protesters, for whom conspiring in the first stanza must be read politically, for whom the cider press in the second stanza acknowledges through a biblical allusion the apocalyptic harvest of the fields of St. Peter. So in Rowe's analysis, this becomes, in a coded way, a poem about that political event. Peterloo is not an event which loads of people know about, but it is an event which sort of directly influences our lives in one way, and that's because the massacre in St. Peter's Fields led to the founding of what was called the Manchester Guardian, which is now simply The Guardian. Now, in The Guardian, I read the psychoanalyst Oliver Burkeman. I really enjoyed his columns. Unfortunately, I think he stopped doing them now. But there's a quotation on your handout from one of his columns. And he's talking about the news. And he says, for a certain segment of the population, the news has come to fill up more and more time, and more subtly to occupy center stage in our subjective sense of reality. So the world of national politics and international crises can feel more important, even more truly real, than the concrete immediacy of our families, neighborhoods, and workplaces. It's not simply that we spend too many hours glued to screens. It's that for some of us, at least, they've altered our way of being in the world, such that the news is no longer one aspect of the backdrop to our lives, but the main drama. According to a principle dating back to the Enlightenment, responsible democratic citizens are those who strive to keep informed about the nation and the wider world, a duty that has been held to be especially critical during times of authoritarianism. Today, though, the principle is often taken as a duty not to turn away from the news. The instinct to look elsewhere is treated as both a sign of privilege and an obliviousness to that luxury. If you're not outraged, you're not paying attention. It's increasingly taken as a given that in order to help or even just signal solidarity with those affected by the events in the news, undocumented immigrants facing the Trump administration's cruelties say it is morally obligatory to remain immersed in the news itself. It's becoming clear, however, that there's a problem with this attitude, quite apart from the impact on our personal happiness. There are reasons to believe that a society in which so many people are so deeply invested in the emotional dramas of the news is far from the embodiment of an ideal democracy. That on the contrary, this level of personal engagement with news is a symptom of the damage that has been done to our public life. So what strikes me there, as in Keats's writing, is the collapsing of distance between two places I'm going to call here and there. And it turns out that here has intense responsibilities towards there. Such responsibilities as McGann feels Two Autumn doesn't fulfill in refusing to comment on contemporary events. But these responsibilities are such that in 2020, we don't know what to do with. These are responsibilities that turn into anxieties, which then generate near infinite commentary, descending into clickbait provocation. And they generate within us a never-ending uncertainty about how to live our lives. Both in literary studies and in our now technologized and internetified lives, we've learned to associate hypervigilance with political conscientiousness. We must stay switched on and tuned in and wirelessly connected to a grievance network, a network of grievances stretching globally in space and through history and time, if we're to do justice to others or to works of literature. And from that perspective, To Autumn seems a poem unaware for McGann of its social moment. If only Keats had a mobile phone, cell phone to take out with him into the stubble fields, he could have received and sent some angry tweets about Peterloo. So what the historicist would seem to prefer is a poem that, like Berkman's Citizen glued to 24-hour news, is in perpetual frictive contact with events. A poem that experiences, as we do, a moral demand to keep abreast of and comment on politics. From this perspective, To Autumn seems an escapist poem, a denial of reality. But what seems like morality might actually be self-interest, a type of paranoid defensiveness. As Berkman remarks of the hyper-networked 21st century, if our interest in news has evolutionary origins, it's because there are obvious survival advantages in staying aware of local and immediate threats to one's life and tribe. One major achievement of civilization is that we've expanded our capacity for caring to include news that doesn't affect us personally, but where we might be able to make a difference, whether by voting or volunteering and donating. And that's obviously a good thing. And I think Berkman means to say that it's a good thing. I don't think he's saying we shouldn't do that. What he is saying, to continue, is that the modern attention economy exploits those urges, not to help us stay abreast of threats or improve the lives of others, but to generate profits for the attention merchants. So it pummels us ceaselessly with incident, regardless of whether it truly matters, and with human suffering, regardless of whether it's in our power to believe it. The belief that we're morally obliged to stay plugged in, that this level of time commitment and emotional investment is the only way to stay informed about the state of the world, begins to look more and more like an alibi for our addiction to our devices. Keats writes to Benjamin Bailey, 12 days have passed since your last letter reached me. What has gone through the myriads of human minds since the 12th? We talk of the immense number of books, the volumes range thousands by thousands, but perhaps more goes through the human intelligence in 12 days than was ever written. Thanks to social media, digital media, and what remains of the legacy media, we now have perpetual access to so much that streams through the human intelligence. Although intelligence might be too strong, too positive a word, and it might be more accurate to downplay the role of conscious will and to suggest instead that we are increasingly porous to, defenseless against, the incursions of data into consciousness. But to focus on Berkman's first point about survival behaviors and threats, Keats, who was multiply bereaved, who lost much of his family as a child, was obsessed with that phenomenon. And one of the things about Keats that I think so resonates with me as a Sri Lankan Tamil, with a mentality shaped, I think, by some of the atrocities Tamils went through and by anxieties passed down to me by my parents, is the way that Keats is agitated by the idea that happiness in the present is always about to be cancelled, either by bad events elsewhere, which are going to leap in and cancel your happiness, or by our own tendency to lose contact with the present moment and get lost in thoughts of the future or the traumatic past. So Keats says, I have never known unalloyed happiness for many days together. The death or sickness of someone has always spoilt my hours. He writes to George and Georgiana that circumstances are like clouds continually gathering and bursting. While we're laughing, the seed of some trouble is put into the wide arable land of events. While we're laughing, it sprouts, it grows, and it bears a poison fruit which we must pluck. Many of us, for a range of reasons, related to our subject positions, related to events in our own lives, many of us have trouble feeling entitled to happiness. In a situation akin to PTSD, our prior experiences have made us think that whatever happiness we do have will be snatched away. And maybe they've also made us feel guilty for those moments of happiness. In a letter poem to his friend Reynolds, Keats writes, "It is a flaw in happiness to see beyond our bourne. It forces us in summer skies to mourn. It spoils the singing of the nightingale." McGann calls Keats self-protective rather than politically concerned. Berkman argues, on the other hand, that the proper functioning of democracy might actually depend on our ability at times to step back from world sufferings. It may depend on a power of thought and feeling that over-attention to the media corrodes. Berkman's also in the business of giving happiness advice. Is Keats in the business of giving happiness advice? Like, is this what we want from poets? It isn't clear if he's saying to Reynolds, don't worry, don't step outside the moment into an uncertain future, or if instead he's acknowledging to Reynolds that this is impossible. Why is it impossible? Because happiness has an inherent flaw. It's the human way of things, contrary to, say, what we're told by mindfulness practitioners, to be always sliding out of the present moment into thoughts of elsewhere and else when. Just when we're supposed to be happy, we see beyond our bourne, as Keats puts it. Bourne means limits. I think it's a word he probably takes from Hamlet. And by seeing beyond our bourne, it spoils everything. So the historicist critic is saying that To Autumn fails precisely in refusing to see beyond its bourne, in just sort of taking refuge in this beautiful stubble field and not thinking about political events outside it. But that division may be unavoidable for those who feel, with the Indian poet Nissim Ezekiel. I'd just like to quote Nissim Ezekiel here. I think literary academics in particular tend to only cite other literary academics who tend to be professors in the UK or the US. And I think sometimes they do need to listen more actually to poets themselves when they're talking about poetry, and that includes poets who live in countries that are not the UK or the US. So Nissim Ezekiel says, writing is and has always been a solitary business, but history is a sweep of events, a sweep of people, and so by its nature, history can never be solitary. As a poet, it's a contradiction I felt most strongly, that the nature of my avocation demanded withdrawal, and that simultaneously events taking place outside demanded that I be connected with them. So with that in mind, let's revisit the concept of social distancing. For Ezekiel, the poet must social distance, must have a critical distance from events, or lose their power as an observer. The poet is not a journalist. The poet is someone who walks the line between conflicting demands. On the one hand, for connection, and that's where McGann finds Keats lacking, but also for withdrawal. And this is where Berkman starts to make the argument that withdrawal can be a condition of intelligent as opposed to knee-jerk political engagement. Connections, writes Ezekiel, and this is in the Times of India in 1997, are not easily made and can be artificial when created out of some sense of artistic and political guilt. Now, I've often felt I kind of struggled to square my opinions about poems with the opinions that sort of become schools of study in academia. And gradually I realized that's maybe because I'm sort of coming to it from this sort of Sri Lankan Tamil perspective. It's a kind of perspective which doesn't feel the kind of guilt that I think certain Anglo-American professors feel. A kind of much literary criticism, as J. Hillis Miller puts it, is created by guilt. It's created by a sense of guilt in occupying oneself with something so trivial, so disconnected from life and reality as novels and poems, instead of thinking about history, politics, and the class struggle. And Keats incarnates that regret. We project onto him that which we accuse in ourselves. But one of the things I think, and I say, and I try to keep saying it, to try and convince some academics of this, is that actually the idea of literature and art and poetry is really important to disenfranchised people all over the world. Those people, including Sri Lankan Tamils, don't want literature to be demystified. They do want it to be historicized, but they also believe in literature, in poetry. That's important to these people. Okay, so even though Joe McGann, I've been talking about this villain, right? I actually quote him now. Although Joe McGann holds back from judgment, the word elusive in his analysis is pejorative. And by pejorative, I think he's attacking Keats. So this quotation is on your handout. I do not mean to derogate from Keats's poem, but to suggest what is involved in so elusive a work as To Autumn, and in all the so-called escapist poetry, which so many readers have found so characteristic of Romanticism. This is the reflexive world of romantic art, where all events are far removed from the terror, King Lud, Peterloo, the 6 acts, the recurrent financial crises of the Regency, and where humanity escapes the inconsequence of George IV, the absurd Prince Regent, the contemptible Wellington. Now, I think that this passage is, despite its denials, moralizing. I think it suggests boldly that for Keats to write a poem, a bittersweet poem about autumn, and of course much else, rather than about the Peterloo massacre, is somehow irresponsible and escapist. And I think that raises a lot of questions. I think one thing it makes me wonder is, what would that Peterloo poem look like? Why demand it of Keats when we already have poems like that, for instance, like Percy Bysshe Shelley's The Mask of Anarchy? When we already know from Keats's letters what his opinions were, we know about his commitment to what he said was the liberal side of the question. We know he was attentive to the protests. We know he cherished the leader of those protests, Henry Hunt's march into London. And the further question arises in our own times of intense accusation, guilt, and apology. If we're following McGann's logic, is it wrong for a poet writing now in 2020 to write a poem that, say, had nothing to do with coronavirus, Black Lives Matter, Trumpism, Brexit, or any of the other emergencies that we're living through? Because the historicist would seem to say there would be something wrong with that. Now, it's possible, obviously, to grant politics and worldly pressures a place in poems that aren't specifically poems about those events. Like, even the simplest reading of Keats's Ode tells us it's about transience and about death. So I guess what I'm saying is that if we reconceive of the relation in To Autumn between pain and its origin, the relation between sadness and its source, then maybe we would think again about the exaggerated importance that we've ascribed to arguing that if the ode manifests a weather system of turbulent and conflicting feelings, that those feelings must be in a clear way derived from Peterloo or the plight of agricultural laborers. Because the thing is, that just isn't how emotions work, either in people or in poems. Sometimes, as stories of trauma illustrate, our feelings are undeniably tied to events. But at other times, and trauma narratives, as well as literary criticism, may be ways to evade this fact, it's much harder to isolate an emotion and say, this is the thing that happened to me that caused it. So I want to illustrate this using what I'm going to call a prose poem from Claudia Rankine's masterpiece, Citizen. I think that's a vexed question. Is it a prose poem or not? Maybe we have a conversation about that afterwards. So Citizen is a book that is concerned with aggressions towards Black people in the US. And many of the sections of the book are explicitly about those sorts of events, but this page isn't. On this page, she depicts a kind of contaminated, saddened, bittersweet pastoral, like Keats. And also like Keats, she's curious about emotions that inhabit that landscape. But the thing about those emotions is you don't know where they came from, and you don't know where they're going to end. So she writes, and actually, to say something quickly about Rankine, some of the scandalousness of this book, has been for the style it's written in prose. And, there have been sort of reactionary arguments that it's not poetry, but actually the prose is so aesthetically rich, I think. I don't have time to talk about that, but I think we need to recognize that. It is a book that's politically really important. It's also a beautiful book that's just amazingly written. So, the rain this morning pours from the gutters, she writes, and everywhere else it is lost in the trees. You need your glasses to single out what you know is there, because doubt is inexorable. You put on your glasses. The trees, their bark, their leaves, even the dead ones are more vibrant wet. Yes, and it's raining. Each moment is like this. Before it can be known, categorized as similar to another thing and dismissed, it has to be experienced, it has to be seen. What did he just say? Did she really just say that? Did I hear what I think I heard? Did that just come out of my mouth, his mouth, your mouth? The moment stinks. Still, you want to stop looking at the trees. You want to walk out and stand among them. And as light as the rain seems, it still rains down on you. So this sort of intrusive memory, what did he just say? Did she really say that? About what was heard and said, that connects with Rankin's writing more explicitly about racism. But I guess what I want to say is that this prose poem, by seeming to stand alone, might have us wonder how isolated, how socially isolated from a range of other events, a particular moment in nature can ever be. The moment that we often think of as the lyric poem. The poet goes off into nature, sees trees, sees rain, has some feelings, writes about them. Because Rankin suggests that even when the poet thinks about trees and rain, it's hard to not also think, to be compelled to think about other, more clearly racial political encounters. And as with Keats's poem and its crisscrossing attitudes towards life and death, it becomes impossible to separate one's feelings in the present from emotional injuries stretching into the past and the future, and also stretching outside of this green space into the city. Right? I'd also add, before returning to Keats's poetry and letters, that the force of To Autumn surely manifests in its posthumous global resonances. Like when I wrote that sentence, it sounded good. Reading it out now it just sounds like academies. Okay, so I think I can explain what I mean by that, though, and I do go on to explain what I mean by that in the lecture I'm reading out, which is good. Okay, so let's say I observe the importance of Keats's poem to the Guyanese poet-activist Martin Carter. Now, could this be to suggest a politics always potential in Keats's poem and waiting to be activated and made original and new by Carter? Just as Michelangelo said, I don't sculpt the statues, God puts the statues in the marble and I just reveal them with my chisel. I don't mean by saying that to underestimate the post-colonial originality of someone like Martin Carter. I mean us to reconceive the relationship between those sorts of poet and canonical British poetry. Because Emma Robinson, in her brilliant Bloodaxe edition of Martin Carter's poetry, which everyone should read, it's brilliant, says that Carter, as a teenager, was absorbed by English literature. One of his favorite poets was Keats, and his younger brother Ben remembers Carter copying the dress of the 19th century poet. And Carter's juvenilia includes an unconvincing rewrite of Keats's poem To Autumn as an ode to midnight, which is on the handout. O midnight hour, why must thy time be sad? Art thou not like the other hours of night? E'en though the day and all its hours had the smile of sunbeams, thou too hast thy light. For every evening, when the sun declines and takes its couch beyond the western world, the stars awake and Venus first doth glow. Why, darkened hour, must all joy be furled, or sorrow show? Hark! Now I hear a wind's quick tongue outpour a tale of grief into the listening leaves. No, 'tis not like a saddened lover's poor and stammering voice, which as he grieves, he speaks and burdens every ear and heart. No, it is like defiance against black fate, and it is like the spirit's mighty quest of truth and life, which never shall abate or seek for rest. So this really, I should say, isn't representative of Carter's mature poetry, which is just wonderful. And, these are great poems. This poem is not a great poem, it's an early poem. But I quote this poem because it reveals something about Keats. If Carter's midnight hour represents a Guyanese world marginal post-colonial perspective, this draws on Keats's positioning of autumn as a seasonal underdog, neglected, in need of reassurance, waiting on empowerment. Where are the songs of spring? Where are they? Think not of them. Thou hast thy music too. As Carter rebels against black fate, the language of romantic poetry, now I hear a wind's quick tongue outpour, a tale of grief, commences a narrative of revolution. Nor does the influence of autumn on Carter cease here, for rereading his great 1958 essay, Defining Freedom and the Nation Under Question, I can't help but hear the unlikeliest of echoes. What stands out most forcibly during slavery and at the abolition of slavery? The flight of the slave from the plantation. Who has not read of slaves escaping from estates and attempting to set up homesteads in the jungle? Who has not heard of the desperate flight of the slaves from the plantation and the hunting down of these slaves by Amerindians hired for the purpose by the slave owners? So it's that rhetorical question of who has not heard of slaves, who has not heard of the desperate flight of the slaves, is so similar to who hath not seen thee oft amid thy store. Sometimes whoever seeks abroad may find thee. Keats's own poems are saturated with echoes of Shakespeare and Milton. They query the line between memory and creation, between self and other, between independence and interdependence, because I don't think the opposite of independence is dependence, it's interdependence, which is a good thing. In Carter's essay, which considers poetic originality alongside national determination, for just a moment, the geographical and the temporal and the cultural distance separating a 19th century English poet and a 20th century Guyanese poet breaks down, and we're pressed to think of world literature in terms of a circulation of feeling states that flow unpredictably from one work into another, achieving political emphasis at times and elsewhere manifesting in less obvious ways. So I'm going to end by talking about Keats's romance, Isabella, or The Pot of Basil. Now, this is a poem that in its very origin and several details speaks to the urge to look frighteningly beyond one's bourne. It's drawn from Boccaccio's Decameron, published in the 14th century. And Boccaccio's narrative is about aristocrats who flee the plague to a haven where they entertain each other with the stories that comprise the book. So they in effect self-isolate, except with the astonishing privilege of one of those celebrities on Twitter posting infuriating selfies from their private island. And one of the stories that these nobles tell concerns Isabella, whose rich brothers want to marry her off to a rich man, but who falls in love with Lorenzo, who's poor. And in response, her brothers kill him, but his ghost visits her. And in this incredibly morbid twist, she digs up his corpse and preserves his mouldering head in a pot of basil she waters with her tears. So, it's a very, very morbid poem. So what happens in this poem is that Keats turns his tale about how the brothers grew rich into, I think, an attack on British colonialism. So this is the argument made so brilliantly by Edward Said in his very famous essay on Jane Austen's Mansfield Park, where he explains that the world of the main characters is predicated by the work done by slaves on sugar plantations in the British colony of Antigua. If we compare this with McGann on To Autumn, we see a difference. For although Said historicizes the novel, he still prizes its aesthetic intellectual complexity, nuancing what he labels as the rhetoric of blame. He says it would be silly to expect Jane Austen to treat slavery with anything like the passion of an abolitionist or a newly liberated slave. Said is not out to cancel Austen, not by any means. But Mansfield Park was published in 1814. Keats wrote Isabella in 1819, and in it, he does skewer colonialism with the passion of an abolitionist. So here are some stanzas on your handout. With her two brothers, this fair lady dwelt, enriched from ancestral merchandise. And for many of them, many a weary hand did swelt in tortured mines and noisy factories, and many once proud quivered loins did melt in blood from stinging whip. With hollow eyes, many all day and dazzling river stood to take the rich oared driftings of the flood. For them the Ceylon diver held his breath and went all naked to the hungry shark. For them his ears gushed blood. For them in death the seal on the cold ice with piteous bark lay full of darts. For them alone did seethe 1,000 men in troubles wide and dark. Half ignorant they turned an easy wheel that set sharp racks at work to pinch and peel. Why were they proud? Because their marble founts gushed with more pride than do a wretch's tears? Why were they proud? Because fair orange mounts were of more soft ascent than lazar stairs. That word refers to people with leprosy. Why were they proud? Because red-lined accounts were richer than the songs of Grecian years. Why were they proud? Again we ask aloud, why in the name of glory were they proud? So these stanzas forcibly reconnect the wealth and status of the brothers with their machinery of exploitation in what we now call the global South. Half ignorant is a clever compound The brothers live by others, aware to some extent of what they're doing to those people, but uninterested in the details. Keats is attacking, I think, British colonialism of his own time period, because as Samuel Miles Ostroff shows, the Gulf of Mannar, the shallow body of water between India and Sri Lanka, was one of the largest sources of pearls for millennia. But from 1770 to 1840, managerial control passed to British powers. And he also explains that attempts to introduce modern diving equipment failed. Of course, none of the wealth represented by the pearls returned to the divers. They were summoned to work by firearms going off in the early morning. They worked all day. They were exposed to punishingly high levels of pressure, which sometimes resulted in physical damage, such as bloody ears and noses. So to borrow from Berkman, Keats seems to be saying to the 19th century reader, if you're not outraged, you're not paying attention. And the repetitions of that stanza, it speaks energetically of injustice with rhetorical fury. For them, a phrase repeating through the second stanza confirms the link between Western wealth and exploitation elsewhere. But I think the really brilliant detail is the subtle repetition of gushed, because gushed describes, first of all, the blood pelting from the ears of the Sri Lankan diver, but then that gore morphs into the water gushing from the fountains of the brothers' manor house. And that shifting of blood into water is also a shifting of blood into ink, because they have their red-lined account books, which now seem to be written in blood. So if, as the critic Frederick Jameson has it, colonialism means that a segment of the economic system as a whole is now located elsewhere, and the consequence of that is the inability to grasp how the system functions as a whole, then Keats provides us with a metaphor that allows us to grasp that system. He looks beyond his bourne. He contemplates atrocities in one place, connecting with wealth in another. He shows that happiness here must acknowledge its relation to unhappiness elsewhere. This is the historicist Keats for whom McGann yearns. The question is whether a poet must always consider events in these terms. So what I want to do finally is to introduce a slightly provocative idea. I'm going to ask us to actually misread these poems and to think about them anachronistically. Let's compare two moments, one from Isabella and one from To Autumn. So this is autumn personified and at leisure, and the workers, it could be actual slaves, panning for gold. And sometimes like a gleaner, thou dost keep steady thy laden head across a brook. Or by a cider press, with patient look, thou watchest the last oozings hours by hours. And then from Isabella, with hollow eyes, many all day in dazzling river stood, to take the rich oared driftings of the flood. Now these images are secret sharings. These images balance each other. They're counter images. Into Autumn, but not in Isabella, Keats transforms labor into idleness, and this is part of McGann's problem with it. Autumn provides a counter image to those brutalized people standing in the river. Those people have hollow eyes, and their job is to all day without reprieve scan the dazzling river for particles of gold. And I think the word take there highlights the fact that those workers aren't taking the gold for themselves, that their overall take from the enterprise is non-existent or nugatory, like that of workers in clothing factories today in the global south. But let me come full circle, apply these images of autumn watching the last oozings hours by hours, and the panners for gold watching the rich ore driftings of the flood, to what Berkman says about us today and our relationship to 24-hour news. Let's examine these figures as possible images of ourselves glued to our phones. And obviously, I don't mean to suggest that our condition is that of indentured workers or slaves, that our suffering is equivalent to theirs. I just want to try out this comparison to see if it reveals something. So according to this perspective, we resemble either those compelled, in our case, not by slave drivers, but by our own anxieties exploited by the attention economy, to endlessly scrutinize a river of news in which danger glisters like gold. Or we're kin to the autumn figure in Keats's own, contemplating the oozings hours by hours of breaking developments and ornery tweets, but with self-possession. It seems like there's a choice here between two ways of experiencing an information-saturated world. And I think it would be a mistake to take the autumn figure's patience as escapism or quietism or defeatism as an acceptance of the status quo. Staying social, but with a distance, that pause for reflection that allows for actual thought could be the starting point of a renewed politics. And thank you. I look forward to answering some of your questions.
Vidyan, thank you so much. That was absolutely fantastic. And we went from those close readings of those poems right up to our contemporary moment, and we went all around the world as well. So yeah, it was fantastic. It was fantastically delivered. I love the way you just spoke to us as though we were in the room with you. You know, Keats would have been delighted to have had an exchange like this, in which it does feel as though distance has been mitigated.
Thank you.
Yeah, it was really brilliant. Thank you so much. If any of you in the audience have a question, we have a few minutes, and if you post it in the chat in the Zoom room, we will get to see it, and Vidyan can answer. So do go ahead if you have a question. But I have a question to start us off, or really a kind of comment on two different things that you were saying, and that you came back to at the end, which is about kind of the saturation of the news and perhaps a need to distance from that. You know, you said at one point that poetry should be listened to because poetry is a kind of knowledge. And I think that there's a very interesting potential distinction between information and knowledge. And maybe underneath, you know, if we had information as a kind of surface river, and then underneath that perhaps is knowledge. Underneath that again, perhaps is understanding, and maybe at the very bottom, like gold in the river you were talking about, is wisdom. And perhaps, you know, if we think of it in that kind of hierarchy, it's necessary for poets to cut away from that surface information stream in order to generate the kinds of knowledge that you were talking about, you know, that you were characterizing poetry as generating. So just wondered if you want to say something about that first.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. Just to answer this quick question that Jake's posted in the chat, and that's J. Hillis Miller who says that about literary criticism. I'm sorry, I must have left that quotation off my handout. But J. Hillis Miller says that about guilt, and if you get in touch with, if you can't find that quotation, you get in touch with me and I'll find it for you. I think what you're saying, Sinead, it reminds me a bit of something Ted Hughes said. Well, here, this idea of the poet as a sort of shaman, right, which is kind of bonkers in a way. But he's saying how, and I actually don't know if this is accurate at all, or just Hughes's bizarrely sort of westernized appropriation of the idea of shamans. But Hughes's idea was that the shaman takes the problems of the community, goes away privately into the woods or something, has the experience, and then sort of comes back to the community with a solution. And I think that if we strip away the sort of bizarre sort of exoticizing architecture, what Hughes is saying there, the basic idea of a kind of going away from immediate contact to then go through a certain kind of process, which is the aesthetic process, but is also cognitive, and which has all that thinking and feeling inside it, and then coming back. I mean, that seems quite important to me. And it's something that is increasingly hard for any of us to do. I mean, not just poets. I mean, it's because you really do feel this guilt that there's all this stuff happening in the world, and I need to stay abreast of it, and I need to look at it on my phone. And then when I'm doing that, it prevents me from ever really concentrating on, you know, I think maybe a journalist can operate like that and must operate like that, but I'm not sure a poet, or at least the kind of poet I am, can operate like that. And I also think that the kinds of essays I write are not really essays that to react like that either. I think they depend on a certain space and distance. I'm just looking at the thoughts in the. I think I'll try and write this up as a paper at some point. And thank you so much for that, Laura. Shash, what do you think Keats's Peterloo would be like? I genuinely don't know. It could be that Keats just didn't really have the gift for writing that kind of poem. You know, I love Shelley's Mask of Anarchy. I think, you know, it does what we want from a Peterloo poem. I think that, like, one of the most interesting books on Keats I've read is John Jones's book called Keats's Dream of Truth. It's quite hard to get hold of now. I've got a sort of illicit PDF if anyone wants a copy or something. Not sure if I had to say that, but he talks about how what Keats is so good at is just describing these feeling states, which is a phrase I used in the lecture, like just these states of feeling. And the problem is that how do you then tie that state of feeling to what caused it, or how do you put it in a narrative? Like, how do you relate it back to politics or something like that? So I think Keats had to write out of his primary gift. I think that many poets are like that. Like, they kind of have a nexus of preoccupations which is tied to their gifts, and that is kind of what they have to give. So in a way, to ask Keats to write a different sort of poem is to ask for him to just be a different sort of person, and that really interests me. And why would we do that? Like we often now, we judge people based on their opinions, right? So we might, that itself can be a problem. Maybe our opinions don't always represent what we really think. Like, maybe our opinions are just cries of pain or something like that. But the interesting thing about Keats is we actually know what he thought about this, because in the letters we know that he was on the side of good and all of that. So why do we want it to be said in the poem too? I think that's what really interests me.
Yeah. Would Keats' contemporary readers have read Autumn as a poem about Peterloo, or was it coded for a knowing audience who would understand the references? I think that's a really logical question to have come out of that particular academic's reading of the poem. Yeah,
that's an excellent question. And I think that, like, I don't want to mischaracterize the work of these historicist critics, but when I read Nicholas Rowe, I suppose my feeling is that he's making the argument that some contemporary readers would have, or would potentially be able to do it. So that's where the idea of the poem as political comes back in. The idea that it's sort of coded in a way. Code suggests someone who can break the code. Tom Paulin describes it as a coded elegy for the Peterloo dead. The idea that those kind of killed people are there in the poem. They're sort of figured there as the animals and stuff like that. So I don't know about that. In a way, that's about us wishing we could re-enter into the mindset of people then, and that's a noble idea. I think we shouldn't, like, I've tried to make Keats's poetry and stuff relevant to our lives today, but you can't look at all of literature in this way. It's a very presentist way of looking at it. And literature is also about learning about the past and about people very different to us. I just think that there's a danger here with Keats's poem of we're sort of denying ourselves this sort of marvelous thing. It's like it's almost like we're fasting or something. Like, we think we don't deserve Keats's poem. It's that idea of guilt that just really intrigues me. That's an excellent question, though.
I think one of the real strengths of your lecture, Vidyan, and I've just heard it, I haven't seen it in advance, but it's just how nuanced it is, both in its reading of Keats. I love the contrast between those two very, very different types of poems, but also how you haven't come down on one side or the other in terms of, poets must be socially engaged, or, poets must, not be socially engaged, and that it's a kind of removed aesthetic practice. And I agree that I don't think we can be prescriptive either way, actually. I think either way is to kind of diminish the potential of what could be written. But I thought that was such a strength that you interrogated these easy categorizations in the way that you did.
Thank you. Like, I think sometimes, poets, like, I love poetry, and poetry, means everything to me. And I'm a very privileged person. I get to go to work and talk to other people about poetry. Of course, I believe that there are more people out there who could get a lot out of poetry. And, I want to try and make poetry of all sorts available to those people. But the thing is that poets themselves have a way of sort of overrating their sort of the immediate revolutionary power of their sort of poems. And then literary critics do this too. Sometimes I think we need to kind of come back down to earth. I think about, the newsagents in Holt Park, where my parents are watching this from, where I grew up, and how, this was sort of my experience of the kinds of magazines, the sort of things you can buy and what people are interested in. You go in and there'd be sort of 3 magazines there about fishing, not just one magazine about fishing, but, there was enough of an audience for magazines about fishing to have like 3 magazines, but no poetry magazine, because it's sort of outside of our little bubble, like our little subculture. I think that we need to think about the fact that poetry isn't connected to politics in all the ways we would ideally like it to be. And so that means that I'm interested in sort of taking this academic conversation and sort of seeing what people who are not all about poetry think about it. And I'm thinking about some of the people listening to this lecture and sort of thinking, this is sort of storm in a teacup. It's like, you know, who cares? And I think that ideally our criticism has to come to terms with that. Who cares? I think it has to kind of contain that and then move on from that a little bit. Yeah.
Well, thank you so much. We've run out of time, but thank you all for coming. And thank you for your questions. And thank you, absolutely, Vidyan. That was an absolutely fantastic addition to our NCLA body of poetry lectures. I really hope it gets published. It's recorded, so it can be accessed on the NCLA Community Archive website. And I think it would deserve listening to at least twice until we can see it in print. But yeah, it was just absolutely brilliant. And thank you so much again. Thank you.
Thank you, Sinead. Thank you, everyone, listening.
Thank you.